The silence in the room was heavier than the threat of a rival's blade. For 7 years, Park Joon-hwa had lived with the clinical finality of a doctor's words echoing in his mind. Permanent sterility. The poison that had nearly taken his life had successfully stripped him of a future. He had accepted the title of Ice King, not just for his ruthlessness, but because his bloodline had effectively frozen solid. He was a man with a massive empire and a hollow legacy, a king destined to be the last of his kind. But as he stared across the mahogany table, the medical files in his mind clashed violently with the reality standing before him. The boy Lucas didn't just have his eyes, he had his poise. While the most hardened captains in Seoul trembled under Joon-hwa's gaze, this 7-year-old with a crown of dark, curly hair stood with his shoulders back and a curious, knowing smile. He looked like a splash of vibrant color in a world of grayscale shadows. "You're lying," Joon-hwa said, though his voice lacked its usual lethal conviction. His hand, clad in the sleeve of a sharp blue suit, moved instinctively to his mouth, a rare gesture of vulnerability. The best doctors in Asia confirmed the damage was irreversible. "You're a plant. A trick sent by the Busan faction." Lucas didn't flinch. He reached out and tapped the paper he had slid across the table. "My mama says doctors are only right about what they can see, not what they can't. I checked the lab's encryption. This result is 99.9% certain. I can show you the raw data if your Wi-Fi is fast enough." Joon-hwa looked at the boy's smile, a bright, defiant thing that reached eyes he recognized as his own. The Ice King felt a hairline fracture spread across his frozen heart. He thought of the night 7 years ago, the scent of cinnamon and warm sugar, and the black woman who had looked at him not with fear, but with a challenge. Naomi Wright. "Han," Joon-hwa barked, his eyes never leaving Lucas. "Yes, Chairman," the security officer stammered, still baffled by the child who had bypassed a billion-won security system. "Get the car. And find me the address of every bakery in the city run by a woman named Naomi." Joon-hwa stood up, the chair scraping against the marble floor like a declaration of war. The Ice King was no longer looking at a medical impossibility. He was looking at his son. And for the first time in a decade, the ice was beginning to burn. The morning air in Seoul was sharp and tasted of impending rain, but inside the glass and steel monolith of the Park Syndicate headquarters, the atmosphere was even colder. Park Joon-hwa sat at the head of a mahogany table that felt more like an altar than a piece of office furniture. Around him, men in razor-sharp suits held their breath, waiting for the Ice King to deliver a verdict that would either make them millions or end their careers. Joon-hwa looked through them, his expression a mask of elegant indifference. To the world, he was a man who had everything, wealth beyond measure, a territory that spanned the peninsula, and a reputation that kept his enemies paralyzed in fear. But to himself he was a dead end. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the final chapter of a story that would end with him, a biological impossibility ever since the night the poison had seared through his veins and robbed him of a legacy. Far below the executive suite, the lobby of the tower was a fortress of biometric scanners and thermal imaging. Security here wasn't just a protocol, it was an obsession. Armed guards with earpieces tracked every movement, and the central server room was rumored to be more secure than the National Bank. It was a system designed to stop armies, to catch spies, and to detect the slightest anomaly. It was not, however, designed to stop a 7-year-old boy with a tablet and a curious mind. Lucas moved through the lobby with the practiced invisibility of someone who spent his life in the corners of a busy bakery. While the guards looked for threats at eye level, Lucas stayed low, his small fingers dancing across the screen of a modified handheld device. He didn't look like a hacker. He looked like a child playing a game, his curly dark hair falling over his forehead as he hummed a quiet tune his mother often sang while kneading dough. But every time his thumb pressed the screen, a camera looped its footage. Every time he stepped near a restricted gate, the magnetic lock hummed and released, convinced by a string of code that a high-ranking executive was passing through. He didn't use the main elevators. He knew they were monitored by weight sensors and live-feed AI. Instead, he found the service lift used for high-end catering, the one that bypassed the general security checkpoints to deliver artisan meals to the inner sanctum. He stood in the corner of the lift, the scent of expensive cologne from a previous occupant clinging to the walls, and watched the floor numbers climb. 40, 41, 42, his heart hammered against his ribs, not out of fear, but out of a tactical excitement he didn't yet have a name for. He had studied the digital blueprints of this building for weeks, finding the backdoor in the HVAC control system that allowed him to spoof a maintenance bypass. On the 47th floor, the doors slid open with a soft chime. This was the heart of the empire. The air here was thinner, quieter, and smelled of ozone and filtered oxygen. Lucas stepped onto the plush carpet, his sneakers making no sound. He walked past the glass-walled offices where assistants froze in mid-sentence, their mouths dropping open at the sight of a child wandering the most dangerous corridor in the city. He didn't stop to explain. He didn't look back. He headed straight for the double doors of the boardroom, where the Ice King sat in his frozen silence. Inside the room, Joon-hwa's lead security detail, Officer Han, caught a flicker of movement on his tablet. His brow furrowed. "Chairman, there's a glitch in the biometric log for the service lift. It says Director Kim just entered the floor, but Kim is currently in Jeju." Joon-hwa didn't look up. "Fix it, Han, and tell the tech team they're replaced if it happens again." Before Han could respond, the heavy doors groaned on their hinges and swung open. The room, filled with some of the most ruthless men in the country, went deathly silent. They expected a rival boss, a police raid, or perhaps an assassin. They did not expect Lucas. The boy walked into the center of the room, the bright light from the floor-to-ceiling windows catching the curls of his hair and the deep, soulful brown of his eyes. He stopped 10 feet from the table, looking up at the man in the blue suit who sat at the head of the long table. The resemblance was so immediate and so violent that several of the captains audibly gasped. It was like looking at a photograph of Joon-hwa from 30 years ago, dipped in the warm golden hues of another world. "You're late for our meeting," Lucas said, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the stagnant air of the boardroom. Joon-hwa slowly lowered his hand from his face, his eyes narrowing. His mind, usually a machine of logic and cold calculation, was screaming. He saw his own jawline, his own defiant tilt of the head, reflected in a child who shouldn't exist. He looked at the boy's mixed heritage, the beautiful complexity of his features, and for the first time in 7 years, the memory of a warm bakery and a woman's laughter hit him like a physical blow. "Who let you in here?" Han demanded, moving toward the boy, his hand instinctively reaching for the zip ties on his belt. "Don't touch him," Joon-hwa said. The command was low, barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the table. The Ice King, the man who felt nothing, felt a strange, terrifying heat rising in his chest. Lucas didn't move as Joon-hwa approached. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I didn't need to be let in," Lucas said, looking up at the man the world feared. "I found the way myself. Just like I found you." He held out the paper, the DNA results that science said were impossible. As Joon-hwa reached out to take it, his fingers brushed against the boy's hand. The contact was electric, a spark of life in a room that had been dead for a decade. The security breach was complete, but as Joon-hwa looked into his son's eyes, he realized the fortress of his heart had been the real target all along. The Ice King was standing in the middle of a thaw, and for the first time he was afraid of the flood that was coming. The bakery, Naomi's Sugar and Spice, was a sanctuary of golden light, and the intoxicating scent of fermented dough and Madagascar vanilla. It was a world measured in grams and minutes, a place where Naomi Wright felt entirely in control. As she leaned over the marble workstation, her white chef's coat dusted with a fine layer of flour, she focused on the delicate task of piping chantilly cream into a batch of fresh choux buns. Her movements were steady, practiced, and calm, the physical manifestation of the peace she had fought 7 years to build. But the peace was a thin crust over a simmering volcano. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound that usually heralded the arrival of a neighborhood regular or a hungry student. Naomi didn't look up immediately. "Just a moment," she said, her voice warm but professional. "The morning brioche is just coming out of the oven." She didn't hear the usual response, "No thank you, Naomi," or "Smells great." Instead, there was a silence so absolute, so cold, that the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air, usually heavy with the humidity of the ovens, suddenly felt thin and sharp. Naomi straightened her back slowly, the piping bag still held in her hand like a shield. She turned and the breath left her lungs in a sharp, ragged hitch. Framed by the delicate lace curtains of the storefront, a line of black sedans sat idling at the curb, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sun like obsidian glass. Standing in the center of her shop, looking utterly out of place amidst the jars of sprinkles and pastel-colored macarons, was Park Joon-hwa. He was dressed in a navy suit so sharp it looked like it could cut skin. His presence was a violent intrusion, a dark ink blot on her sun-drenched sanctuary. Behind him, two men in identical black suits stood like gargoyles, their eyes scanning the room with predatory efficiency. Joon-hwa didn't speak. He simply looked at her. His gaze, famously known as the Ice King's stare, was fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He looked at her dark skin, the dusting of flour on her cheeks, and the way her eyes flashed with a mixture of terror and ancient, deep-seated fury. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Naomi," he said, his voice a low melodic rumble that vibrated in the small space. Naomi's grip on the piping bag tightened until her knuckles turned white. "You have no business here, Joon-hwa. This is a place of business. Get out." "A place of business," he repeated, his eyes drifting to the back of the shop, where a small, colorful backpack sat on a stool. "And a place of secrets. Where is he?" "There is no he," Naomi snapped, stepping forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "There is only me. There is only work. Whatever you think you know, you're wrong." Joon-hwa took a step toward her, the polished leather of his shoes clicking rhythmically on the checkered tile floor. He stopped just inches from the work table, the scent of his expensive metallic cologne clashing with the sweet aroma of her baking. He reached out, his long fingers hovering over a tray of unfinished tarts, but he didn't touch them. He looked up and for the first time Naomi saw a crack in the ice. "The boy came to me," Joon-hwa whispered. "He walked into my tower. He sat at my table. He has my eyes, Naomi. And he has a mind that bypassed a security system worth more than this entire block." Naomi felt the world tilt. Lucas, her brilliant, curious, reckless boy. She had tried so hard to keep him away from the darkness of his father's world, to raise him in the warmth of the sun and the sweetness of the sugar. But the blood in his veins was too strong. The genius she had admired in the man standing before her had been passed down like a curse. "He's a child," she said, her voice trembling. "He doesn't belong to you. He doesn't belong in that world of yours." "He belongs to the truth," Joon-hwa countered. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the DNA report, the paper crinkling in his hand. 7 years I lived as a man with no future. 7 years I was told I was a ghost at the end of a line. And all that time you were here, raising a king in a bakery. I was raising a son." Naomi shouted, the anger finally boiling over. She slammed the piping bag onto the table, a spray of white cream splattering across the marble. "I was raising a boy who knows how to laugh, who knows how to care, who isn't made of stone and blood. I didn't hide him to hurt you, Joon-hwa. I hid him to save him from becoming you." The silence that followed was deafening. The men at the door shifted uncomfortably, sensing the raw, jagged emotion tearing through the room. Joon-hwa looked at the splatter of cream on the table, then back at Naomi. The Ice King didn't look angry. He looked haunted. "You can't save him anymore," he said quietly. "The moment he stepped into my tower, the world saw him. My enemies saw him. They don't see a boy, Naomi. They see a target. They see the only way to destroy me." Before Naomi could respond, the door to the back room creaked open. Lucas stepped out, his curly hair messy, a half-eaten cookie in his hand. He looked at his mother, then at the tall man in the suit. He didn't look afraid. He looked interested. "Mom?" Lucas asked, his voice small but clear. "Is he the one?" Naomi rushed to her son, pulling him into her arms, shielding him with her body. She looked at Joon-hwa, her eyes burning with a desperate, protective fire. "If you touch him, if you bring your world into this shop, I will destroy you myself. I don't care who you are." Joon-hwa looked at the boy, his reflection, his legacy, his impossible miracle. He looked at the woman who had dared to defy him for 7 years. The ice was gone, replaced by a fierce, terrifying resolve. "I'm not here to take him," Joon-hwa said, his voice regaining its command. "I'm here to protect what's mine. From this moment on, this bakery is under the protection of the Park Syndicate. And God help anyone who tries to cross this threshold." He turned on his heel, his coat swirling around him like a cape. As he walked out the door, the bell chimed again, a mocking, cheerful sound. Naomi stood in the center of her flower-dusted sanctuary, holding her son tightly, realizing that the fire had finally met the ice, and the resulting flood was about to change everything. The private medical wing of the Park Syndicate's headquarters was a place of sterile white light and pressurized silence. It was here 10 years ago that Park Joon-hwa had been told his future was a hollow void. The same lead physician, Dr. Choi, stood before him now, his hands trembling slightly as he held a digital tablet. Joon-hwa sat in a leather chair that felt like a throne in a tomb, his eyes fixed on the man who had once delivered his death sentence. Naomi stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the twilight of the Seoul skyline. She had refused to sit. She had refused the tea, the water, and the expensive silk wrap offered to her to cover her flower-stained apron. She looked like a captive queen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze flickering toward Lucas. The boy was sitting on an examination table, swinging his legs and watching the heartbeat monitor's rhythmic pulse with the fascination of a born engineer. "The results, doctor," Joon-hwa commanded. His voice was a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to make the very air in the room turn to frost. Dr. Choi cleared his throat, his eyes darting toward Naomi before settling on his employer. "Chairman, I ran the sequence 3 times. I used the most advanced CRISPR-based mapping available. I even cross-referenced the markers from your original 2014 profile." He swallowed hard. "The results are consistent across all platforms. There is no margin for error." He turned the tablet around. The screen displayed a complex web of genetic markers, blue for the father, gold for the mother, and a perfect shimmering blend for the child. At the bottom, in cold, unyielding font, was the number 99.99%. "Blood doesn't lie," Lucas whispered from the table, quoting a line from one of the spy thrillers he liked to read. Joon-hwa stared at the screen. For a decade, he had built a fortress around his heart, bricked in by the belief that he was a man with no tomorrow. He had leaned into the cruelty of the Ice King persona because there was no one to leave a legacy to, no reason to be anything other than a weapon. He had viewed his body as a failed vessel, a machine that could kill but never create. Now, the numbers on the screen were shattering that foundation. The hairline fracture he had felt in the bakery was now a gaping canyon. He wasn't a dead end. He wasn't the last of his line. He stood up slowly, his movements fluid and predatory. He walked toward Lucas, stopping just inches from the boy. He reached out, his hand hovering near the boy's face before finally, tentatively, tucking a stray dark curl behind Lucas's ear. The boy didn't flinch. He looked up at Joon-hwa with an expression that was terrifyingly observant. 10 years, Joon-hwa said, his voice barely audible. 10 years of believing a lie. It wasn't a lie then, Naomi said, her voice cutting through the clinical silence like a blade. She finally moved away from the window, her footsteps soft but heavy with the weight of the past. You were dying, Joon-hwa. Your body was a wreck. The doctors told the truth based on what they knew. But they didn't know about the night in the garden. They didn't know that life is more stubborn than poison. Joon-hwa turned to look at her. The anger he had felt in the bakery had evolved into something more complex. A raw, aching vulnerability that he didn't know how to handle. He saw the woman who had carried this secret alone, who had shielded his son from the very men currently standing guard outside the door. "You let me believe I was alone," he said. "I let you believe you were free," she countered. "I saw what your world did to you. I saw the ice forming over your eyes even back then. Why would I give my son to a man who was already a ghost?" Joon-hwa looked back at the tablet, the 99.99% glaring back at him. It was the physical proof of a miracle he hadn't asked for but now realized he would kill to keep. The science was absolute. The child was his. The legacy was real. "The lie is over," Joon-hwa declared, his voice regaining its steel. He looked at Dr. Choi. "Destroy these records. If a single byte of this data leaves this room, if a single word of this reaches the board or the rival syndicates before I am ready, I will ensure you never see the sun again." Dr. Choi nodded frantically, taking the tablet and scurrying out of the room. The silence that remained was different. It was no longer the silence of the grave, but the silence before a storm. Joon-hwa looked at Naomi, then at Lucas. The Ice King was dead, or at least the man he had been for 10 years was. In his place was a father who had just realized his enemies had been handed the ultimate weapon, and he had been handed the ultimate reason to destroy them all. "He stays with me," Joon-hwa said, his gaze fixed on Naomi. "And so do you. Not as prisoners, but as the only things in this world that matter." Naomi looked at the closed door, then at her son, realizing that the blood had spoken, and now the world would have to listen. The hum of the high-tech medical wing faded as Park Joon-hwa's gaze lingered on the dusting of flour still visible on Naomi's collar. In the sharp, clinical silence of the present, his mind drifted back to a time when his world wasn't made of reinforced glass and cold steel, a time when the air smelled of rain and yeast instead of antiseptic. It was the summer of 2014, a season that felt like a lifetime ago. Back then, Joon-hwa wasn't the Ice King. He was a rising star in the Syndicate, a man of quiet movements and sharp eyes who operated in the shadows of the city's concrete canyons. He was understated, a predator who hadn't yet been forced to grow a skin of ice to survive. Naomi, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of ambition and sugar, an aspiring baker who had just arrived in Seoul with nothing but a set of heirloom rolling pins and a dream to open a patisserie that tasted like home. They had met by accident in a small walled garden tucked behind a row of crumbling hammocks. It was a place where the city's roar was muffled by ivy-covered stone, and for 3 months it became their world. Joon-hwa remembered the first night clearly. He had been escaping a tense meeting, his knuckles bruised and his heart heavy with the gray weight of his chosen life. He had found her there, sitting on a stone bench, sketching designs for tiered cakes in a worn leather notebook. She had looked up, and instead of the fear he was used to seeing in people's eyes, he had found a piercing, vibrant curiosity. "You look like you've been fighting ghosts," she had said, her voice a warm melody that cut through his exhaustion. She hadn't asked who he was or what he did. She had simply reached into a paper bag and offered him a warm ginger biscuit. That single simple gesture had been the start of a brief, intense fire. For those few weeks, Joon-hwa lived a double life. By day, he was a calculated soldier of the underworld. By night, he was a man who learned the difference between cinnamon and cardamom, a man who let a woman with flour-stained hands teach him how to breathe again. Naomi was his fire. She was loud, passionate, and entirely unimpressed by the power he wielded elsewhere. In the garden, surrounded by the scent of night-blooming jasmine, they were just two people existing in the space between the light and the dark. He remembered the way her skin felt against his, warm and soft, a stark contrast to the cold weapons he carried. He remembered the taste of her kisses, which always carried a hint of vanilla and a promise of a life he didn't think he was allowed to have. The intensity of their connection was terrifying. For the first time, Joon-hwa found himself looking at the exits of his life, wondering if he could walk away from the Syndicate and vanish into the steam of a bakery. He had begun to imagine a future that wasn't written in blood, but the shadows of his world were long. The night in the garden that Naomi had referenced, Their final night together before the accident had been a desperate, beautiful collision. They had clung to each other as if they knew the storm was coming. He hadn't told her that he was being targeted, that the internal politics of the syndicate were turning lethal. He had only wanted one more night of being the man she saw, not the man the world knew. When he left her before sunrise, he had intended to return once the business was settled. He hadn't known that within 48 hours, he would be lying in a hospital bed, his body ravaged by a toxin that was supposed to end his life. He hadn't known that the recovery would take months, or that by the time he emerged, he would have to become the Ice King just to stay alive. To protect her, he had convinced himself that she was better off thinking he had simply vanished, a ghost of a summer romance that was never meant to last. Standing now in the sterile medical wing, looking at the son who was the living proof of that final night, Joon-hwa felt the weight of every day he had spent in the cold. The sweet memory wasn't just a flashback. It was a reminder of the man he used to be before the ice set in. He looked at Naomi, seeing the woman who had carried the warmth of that garden for 7 years while he had been freezing to death in a tower of his own making. The fire wasn't just in the past anymore. It was standing right in front of him, demanding to be recognized. The warm golden glow of Naomi's sugar and spice was now encased in a ring of cold black steel. For the first time in 7 years, the neighborhood of quiet alleys and residential charm felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the Park Syndicate. Park Joon-hwa didn't do things halfway. If he was to protect his legacy, he would do it with the full force of his empire, even if that meant turning a boutique patisserie into a fortified bunker. Inside, the air still smelled of cinnamon and proofing dough, but the rhythm of the bakery was fractured. Naomi moved through her kitchen with a mechanical stiffness, her eyes constantly darting toward Lucas, who sat at a small bistro table near the front window, drawing complex geometric shapes on a flour-dusted napkin. Outside the glass, 2 of Joon-hwa's men stood like statues, their earpieces glinting in the morning sun. Joon-hwa himself was leaning against the counter, a cup of black coffee in his hand that he hadn't touched. He was watching the street, his eyes scanning every passing car with the precision of a hawk. He was the Ice King in a place built for warmth, a predator in a sanctuary. "This isn't protection," Naomi whispered, coming to stand across from him. "It's a siege. You're scaring away my customers. You're making my son a prisoner in his own home." Joon-hwa didn't turn his head. "Your customers are the least of your concerns, Naomi. The moment Lucas stepped into my office, the digital footprint he left was a beacon. My enemies aren't just looking for me anymore. They're looking for why I've spent 3 hours in a bakery in a neighborhood I have no business visiting." "Then leave," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Take your men and go. Let us go back to being nobody." "It's too late for that," Joon-hwa said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling register. He finally turned to look at her, and for a second, the ice in his eyes was replaced by a grim, dark realization. The shadow has already fallen. Across the street, perched in the darkened window of a second-story apartment that had been vacant for months, a long-range lens clicked. The man behind the camera wasn't a photographer. He was a scout for the Kim Syndicate, Joon-hwa's most vicious rivals. He watched as the most feared man in Seoul, a man who hadn't shown a moment of human weakness in a decade, reached out and adjusted the collar of the mixed-race boy sitting by the window. The scout smiled, a jagged, ugly expression. He didn't need a DNA report to know what he was looking at. The resemblance was written in the boy's profile, in the way he held his head, and in the way Joon-hwa stood guard over him like a dragon over its only treasure. The Ice King, the man who was supposed to be a dead end, had a son. "I have it," the scout whispered into a burner phone. "The rumors were true. The king has a prince. And the mother? She's the one from the garden. They're all at the bakery on 4th Street. He's exposed." Inside the shop, Joon-hwa's hand froze on his coffee cup. A sixth sense, honed by years of surviving ambushes and betrayals, prickled at the back of his neck. He didn't look at the window across the street. He didn't give the scout the satisfaction of knowing he had been spotted. Instead, he slowly set the cup down on the marble counter. Han, Joon-hwa said, his voice perfectly calm, which was always when he was most dangerous. The lead security officer appeared in the doorway instantly. Sir, secure the perimeter. Bring the armored transport to the rear entrance, Joon-hwa commanded. He looked at Naomi, whose face had gone pale as she read the sudden shift in his posture. And call the tech team. I want the surveillance feed for this entire block wiped, but it's likely already too late. What is it? Naomi asked, reaching for Lucas and pulling him toward her. Joon-hwa, what's happening? Joon-hwa walked over to them, his presence filling the small space, cutting off the light from the window. He looked at his son, the miracle he hadn't known he needed, and then at the woman who was the only person he had ever truly loved. The secret was out. The Ice King's weakness was officially public, and in his world, a weakness was an invitation for a massacre. The first shadow has passed over us, Joon-hwa said, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. My enemies know you exist. And from this second on, the bakery is no longer a home. It's the front line of a war. He reached out and took Naomi's hand. Her skin was warm, dusted with the flour of her trade, while his was cold and steady. He didn't let go. He couldn't. The world now knew that the Ice King had a heart, and he knew they would stop at nothing to tear it out of his chest. The transition from a secret family to a public target was complete, and the city of Seoul was about to find out exactly how much fire a man made of ice could truly unleash. The transformation of the neighborhood happened with the surgical precision of a military occupation. By noon the following day, the quiet, cherry blossom-lined street where Naomi had built her life was no longer hers. For obsidian-black SUVs were stationed at every corner like silent sentinels, their engines idling with a low predatory hum. Men with earpieces and tactical holsters hidden beneath tailored wool coats paced the sidewalks, their gazes sweeping over the local grocers and elderly residents with cold, unblinking efficiency. Inside the bakery, the morning rush was non-existent. The regular customers, the elderly couple from the florist shop, the young teachers from the nearby primary school, had taken one look at the grim-faced men standing outside the door and kept walking. The iron ring had been closed, and while it was designed to keep the world out, it was effectively trapping Naomi in. Naomi stood behind her counter, her hands trembling as she tried to decorate a batch of cupcakes. The frosting, usually smooth and perfect, was jagged and uneven. She looked out the window and saw a neighbor she had known for years cross the street to avoid walking past the bakery. It felt like a slow-motion car crash, watching the community she loved dissolve into a state of paralyzed fear. They think I'm part of some criminal syndicate now, Naomi whispered, her voice tight with suppressed rage. She didn't look at Joon-hwa, who was seated at the far corner table, a laptop open in front of him and a secure satellite phone resting by his hand. Joon-hwa didn't look up from his screen. Let them think what they want. Their opinion won't keep your son alive. My men will. You're suffocating us, she said, finally turning to face him. She slammed the palette knife down onto the marble, the sound echoing in the empty shop. Look at this street, Joon-hwa. You've turned a neighborhood of families into a war zone. I spent 7 years making people feel safe here. Now they won't even look at my windows. Joon-hwa closed the laptop with a soft click. He stood up, his presence immediately dominating the small flour-dusted room. He walked toward her, his eyes like two chips of dark flint. Safety is an illusion, Naomi. You had it for 7 years because my enemies didn't know you existed. That illusion is shattered. If I pull my men back, if I give you the peace you're asking for, you and Lucas will be in a trunk by nightfall. I never asked for your protection, she hissed, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. You don't have to ask for what is already owed to my son, he countered. He reached out, his hand stopping just short of her cheek, as if the ice in his veins was warning him against the warmth of her skin. I am not here to win over your neighbors. I am here to ensure that when this war is over, you are both still standing. In the back of the shop, Lucas was oblivious to the tension. He was sitting on a crate, surrounded by 2 of the elite guards Joon-hwa had assigned as his personal detail. The boy wasn't afraid of the men. He was fascinated by their gear. He was currently asking one of them, a scarred veteran named Kim, about the encryption on their shortwave radios. "It's a rolling code, isn't it?" Lucas asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. "To prevent frequency jamming?" The guard, who was trained to be a killing machine, looked down at the boy and gave a reluctant, almost invisible nod. He seemed completely disarmed by the child's intelligence, a tiny version of the boss who was asking questions that most grown men wouldn't understand. Naomi watched the scene from the doorway, her heart aching. Lucas was thriving in the attention, but he was also learning the language of the underworld. He was picking up the habits of a soldier before he had even finished being a child. "He likes them," Joon-hwa said softly, appearing behind her. "That's what scares me the most," Naomi replied. She looked at Joon-hwa, her expression a mix of sorrow and defiance. "You're not just protecting his body, Joon-hwa. You're changing his soul. You're surrounding him with weapons and shadows, and you think that's a legacy." "It's the only legacy I have left to give," he said. The friction between them was a physical thing, a clash of worlds that refused to align. To Naomi, the guards were a violation of her sanctuary. To Joon-hwa, they were the only wall between life and death. As the sun began to set over the quiet neighborhood, casting long dark shadows from the armored cars across the bakery floor, Naomi realized that the peaceful life she had fought for was gone. The Ice King had moved his throne into her kitchen, and while the perimeter was secure, the woman who lived inside it had never felt more in danger. The rain had finally begun to fall over Seoul, a gray rhythmic drizzle that washed the flour dust from the bakery's front steps. Inside Naomi's sugar and spice, the atmosphere was a thick, suffocating blend of sweet vanilla and cold tension. Naomi was working on a complicated wedding cake, her fingers trembling as she applied delicate silver pearls to the fondant. Every few minutes, she looked toward the corner booth where Lucas was helping Joon-hwa with a security audit of the shop's digital infrastructure. They looked so much alike, the same focused brow, the same way they tapped their chins when thinking that it hurt to watch. The bell above the door gave its cheerful, high-pitched chime, but no one in the room reacted with cheer. Two of the guards at the entrance immediately stepped into the path of the newcomer. It was a delivery courier, soaked from the rain and looking visibly shaken by the two muscular men blocking his way. I have a delivery," the courier stammered, holding out a refrigerated box. "A custom order. Signature required." Naomi wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward, but Joon-hwa was already on his feet. He moved with a silent, predatory grace, placing himself between Naomi and the courier. "I didn't order anything," Naomi said, her brow furrowed. "I'm the one who makes the cakes here. I don't buy them." "The slip says it's a gift," the courier insisted, his voice cracking. "From a loyal admirer in the business district." Joon-hwa's eyes narrowed into slivers of dark ice. He didn't look at the courier, he looked at the box. "Han," he said, his voice a low, vibrating warning. Officer Han stepped forward wearing black latex gloves. He took the box from the courier and placed it on a distant table, far from the counters where Naomi worked. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Lucas had stopped typing, his young face suddenly pale as he felt the shift in the room's energy. "Mom, get back," Lucas whispered, his voice sounding far too old for a 7-year-old. Han opened the box with clinical precision. Inside was a stunning multi-layered sponge cake, decorated with intricate sugarwork flowers, lilies beautiful and pale. It was a masterpiece that rivaled Naomi's own work. But as the lid came off, a faint, sickly sweet odor began to drift through the shop. It wasn't the scent of sugar or cream. It was something metallic, something that smelled of the earth after a lightning strike. Joon-hwa's face went deathly pale, a rare sight for the man who feared nothing. He recognized that scent. It was the same chemical odor that had filled his lungs 10 years ago, the night the accident had stripped him of his future. It was the toxin of the Kim Syndicate, a concentrated, airborne variant of the poison that had supposedly made him sterile. "Cover your mouths. Now!" Joon-hwa roared, lunging for Naomi and Lucas. He threw his jacket over both of them, shoving them toward the industrial walk-in cooler at the back of the kitchen. Han slammed the lid of the box shut, but the damage was already done. The courier, realizing the game was up, tried to bolt, but the second guard tackled him into a display of macaroons, shattering glass and scattering pastel cookies across the floor. Inside the cramped, cold space of the walk-in cooler, Naomi held Lucas so tightly she could feel his heart hammering against her chest. She looked at Joon-hwa, who was standing at the heavy steel door, his hand on the latch, his face a mask of cold, murderous fury. "It's in the frosting," Joon-hwa said, his voice shaking with a rage so profound it felt like the walls were vibrating. "If you had tasted it, if you had even breathed it in for a few more seconds." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Naomi looked at the racks of flour, the bowls of batter, and the vibrant life she had built. In an instant, her sanctuary had been turned into a gas chamber. The very thing she loved, the craft of baking, had been used as a delivery system for death. "They used my shop," Naomi whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "They used my life to try and kill us." "They didn't just try to kill us," Joon-hwa corrected, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying light. "They tried to use your passion to destroy your son. They wanted you to be the one who fed him the poison." The horror of it finally broke through Naomi's defiance. For days she had fought the guards, fought the SUVs, and fought the Ice King for the sake of her peaceful life. But as she sat on the cold floor of the cooler, surrounded by the scent of the very ingredients she used every day, she realized that peace was a ghost. The world she had lived in for 7 years was gone, replaced by a reality where a cake wasn't just a dessert, it was a weapon. Outside, she could hear the muffled sounds of the courier being interrogated, the harsh, guttural commands of Joon-hwa's men, and the sound of the shop being swept for further threats. The sugar and spice she knew was dead. Joon-hwa knelt in front of her, his large, cold hand cupping her face. "Now do you see, Naomi? This is why the perimeter exists. This is why I am here. To them, you and Lucas are just pieces on a board. They don't care about the bakery. They don't care about the flowers. They only care about the blood." Naomi looked at Lucas, who was staring at the steel door with an expression of cold, analytical calculation that mirrored his father's. She realized then that the Ice King wasn't just a title Joon-hwa wore. It was a shield he had built to survive a world that sent poisoned lilies to children. "I see," Naomi said, her voice hollow and hard. She stood up, brushing the flour from her apron, her eyes meeting Joon-hwa's with a new dark understanding. "I see everything now. If they want to use my world to fight this war, then I'm done hiding. Tell your men to clear the shop. And then tell me who sent that cake. I want to know exactly whose world I have to help you burn down." Joon-hwa felt a jolt of something he hadn't felt in a decade. A flicker of pride mixed with a terrifying protective heat. The baker was gone. The queen had arrived. The Ice King nodded, the latch of the cooler clicking open as they stepped out into the ruins of her sanctuary, ready to face the fire together. The rain continued to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Syndicate's private residential penthouse, turning the sprawling lights of Seoul into a blurred, neon mosaic. Inside, the air was still and heavy with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the faint, lingering metallic tang of the day's violence. For the first time in his life, Park Joon-hwa found the silence of his home unsettling. He stood in the doorway of the library, his silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar, watching the boy. Lucas was sitting cross-legged on a velvet ottoman, a holographic tablet resting on his knees. The blue light of the screen cast sharp, angular shadows across his face, highlighting the high cheekbones and the focused, narrow set of his eyes, features that Joon-hwa now realized were a direct mirror of his own. Joon-hwa had led armies. He had negotiated treaties that saved billions of won. He had looked death in the eye without blinking. But standing there watching his son, he felt a strange, paralyzing uncertainty. How did one speak to a miracle? Especially a miracle that had inherited his own calculating mind? He stepped into the room, his footsteps silent on the hand-woven rug. Lucas didn't look up, but his fingers paused on the screen. "Your gait is heavy tonight," the boy said, his voice quiet but steady. Third and fourth lumbar tension. You're stressed. Joon-hwa stopped, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, the first real smile he had felt in years. You've been observing me. I observe everything, Lucas replied, finally looking up. It's how I stayed safe before you showed up. Now, it's how I know if the perimeter is actually holding. Joon-hwa sat in the armchair opposite the ottoman, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He looked at the tablet. It wasn't a game. Lucas was looking at a 3D rendering of the building's structural weaknesses. You found the ventilation blind spots, Joon-hwa noted, his voice dropping to a low, appreciative rumble. They're too wide on the north side, Lucas pointed out, his brow furrowing in a way that looked exactly like Joon-hwa's during a board meeting. If I were the Kim Syndicate, I wouldn't use a cake next time. I'd use a drone through the intake vents. Joon-hwa felt a surge of pride so sharp it was almost painful. It was followed quickly by a wave of guilt. This boy should be thinking about school, about toys, about the sweetness of his mother's bakery. Instead, he was thinking like a general under siege. Lucas, Joon-hwa said softly, the name still feeling foreign on his tongue. I never intended for you to have to think this way. But I have to, don't I? Lucas asked, his dark eyes searching Joon-hwa's. Because of who you are. Because of who I am. The Ice King reached out, his hand hovering in the air before he finally settled it on Lucas's shoulder. The boy didn't pull away. He leaned into the touch, a small, nearly imperceptible movement that broke something deep inside Joon-hwa. The man who was supposed to be sterile, the man who was supposed to be a dead end, felt the warmth of his own blood flowing through the small frame beneath his hand. When I was your age, Joon-hwa began, his gaze drifting to the rain-streaked window, I lived in a small room in Incheon. I didn't have tablets or drones. I had a deck of cards and a father who taught me that the only way to survive was to be colder than the world around me. I believed him for 30 years. Lucas watched him intently. Was he right? He was right about survival, Joon-hwa admitted. But he was wrong about everything else. He told me that love was a liability. That having someone to lose was the ultimate weakness. He looked back at Lucas, his expression softening into something raw and human. And then I met your mother. And then I met you. And I realized that the things we are willing to die for are the only things that actually make us strong. Lucas reached up, his small hand covering Joon-hwa's large, scarred fingers. Mama says you're like the moon. You're cold and you're far away, but you control the tides. She said I shouldn't be afraid of the dark because I have your light in me. Joon-hwa felt his throat tighten. He thought of Naomi, sleeping fitfully in the next room, her life upended by his shadows, yet still finding a way to paint him in a light he didn't deserve. I'm learning, Joon-hwa whispered, more to himself than to the boy. I'm learning how to be more than a king. I'm learning how to be a father. It's not that hard, Lucas said, a flash of his mother's playful spirit lighting up his face. Just stop looking at the monitors for 5 minutes and tell me how you used to cheat at cards. I saw the deck in your desk drawer. The markings are clever, but I found the pattern in the corner of the King of Hearts. Joon-hwa let out a short, surprised laugh, a sound that hadn't echoed in these walls for a decade. He stood up, picked up the boy, and sat him on the chair beside him. He pulled the worn deck of cards from his pocket, the blue light of the tablet forgotten. In that quiet corner of a fortress, surrounded by the threat of war and the weight of a dark empire, the Ice King began to melt. He didn't teach his son how to shoot or how to kill. Instead, under the watchful eyes of the Seoul skyline, he taught him how to read the tells of a man's heart. It was a small step, a quiet connection, but as the rain slowed to a drizzle, Joon-hwa realized that his legacy wasn't in the buildings he owned or the enemies he crushed. It was right here, in the curious eyes of a boy who was far more brilliant than he would ever be. The night air was unnaturally still, the kind of heavy pressurized silence that precedes a tectonic shift. Inside Naomi's Sugar and Spice, the only light came from the blue-tinted security monitors and the soft, rhythmic hum of the industrial refrigerators. Naomi sat on a stool in the kitchen, her fingers curled around a cold mug of tea, watching Joon-hwa. He was standing by the back exit, his silhouette a sharp, jagged edge against the stainless steel. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He was listening to the city, his body tuned to a frequency of danger that Naomi was only just beginning to understand. Lucas was asleep on a makeshift cot in the pantry, surrounded by sacks of flour and sugar. To any other child it would have been a strange place to rest, but for Lucas, it was the heart of his mother's world, the only place that still felt safe. "They're here," Joon-hwa said. His voice wasn't a whisper. It was a low vibrational growl that made the hair on Naomi's arms stand up. "How do you know?" she asked, standing up, her heart already beginning to gallop. "The monitors show nothing." "The monitors are looping," Joon-hwa replied, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were no longer those of the man who had shared a quiet moment with his son over a deck of cards. They were the eyes of the Ice King, void of warmth, crystalline, and utterly lethal. Lucas was right about the north intake. They jammed the feed 30 seconds ago. Before Naomi could breathe, the world exploded. A flashbang grenade shattered the front display window, the concussive force blowing the delicate lace curtains into ribbons and sending a spray of glass through the shop like diamond hail. The sound was deafening, a white noise roar that felt like it was trying to turn Naomi's brain to liquid. "Get him!" Joon-hwa roared, lunging through the smoke to shove Naomi toward the pantry. The front door didn't just open, it was erased from its hinges. 6 men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by matte black balaclavas, surged through the ruins of the seating area. They weren't looking for money or drugs. They moved with a singular, terrifying focus toward the back of the shop. They were hunting the impossible heir. Joon-hwa didn't wait for them to reach the kitchen. He met them in the narrow hallway between the display cases and the ovens. He moved with a speed that defied his heavy frame, a blur of navy wool and silver steel. The first attacker didn't even see the blow that crushed his windpipe. Joon-hwa used the man's falling body as a shield, drawing his suppressed pistol and firing 3 shots in a tight rhythmic sequence. 3 men went down, their blood staining the checkered tile floor, mixing with the spilled flour from a broken bag. "Mama!" Lucas's voice was small, but it wasn't panicked. He was standing in the pantry doorway, his eyes wide, his tablet already in his hand. "Stay down!" Naomi screamed, grabbing a heavy marble rolling pin from the counter, the only weapon she had. The siege was relentless. A second wave of attackers breached the rear entrance, coming through the alleyway. The scent of gunpowder and ozone began to choke the air, clashing violently with the lingering smell of the morning's brioche. Joon-hwa was a wall of pure violence, his movements calculated and cold. He was fighting not just for his life, but for the legacy he had only just realized he possessed. "The back gate is open," Lucas shouted, his fingers flying across his tablet. "They've bypassed the electronic locks on the armored SUVs." Joon-hwa cursed, a harsh guttural sound. He realized the trap. They weren't just trying to kill them. They were trying to isolate them, stripping away his defenses one by one until Lucas was vulnerable. "Naomi, the flour!" Joon-hwa yelled over the sound of gunfire. She didn't ask why. She grabbed 2 20-pound bags of high-grade bread flour, ripped them open, and heaved them toward the center of the kitchen. As the next 3 attackers rounded the corner, Joon-hwa fired a single shot into the air, the muzzle flash igniting the fine, combustible dust. A localized explosion of white fire and pressure knocked the attackers back, blinding them and filling the room with a thick, choking cloud. In the chaos, Joon-hwa grabbed Naomi and Lucas, hauling them toward the hidden service lift he had insisted on installing days prior. "Go. Now." "What about you?" Naomi cried, her eyes stinging from the flour and smoke. "I am the distraction," Joon-hwa said. He looked at Lucas, his expression softening for a fraction of a second, a final silent promise. "I'll meet you at the extraction point. Don't stop for anything." As the lift doors slid shut, the last thing Naomi saw was the Ice King turning back toward the smoke, his silhouette framed by the orange glow of the burning bakery. The patisserie, her dream, her sanctuary, was being consumed by the flames of a war she hadn't asked for. The siege of the patisserie was over, but the hunt had only just begun. As the lift descended into the dark basement, Naomi held Lucas to her chest, realizing that while the bakery was gone, the fire in her heart was just beginning to burn as hot as the one Joon-hwa was currently fighting. The impossible heir was safe for now, but the world had seen the lengths the Ice King would go to protect his blood, and the cost was written in smoke and ash. The sky over Seoul had turned a bruised, metallic purple by the time the smoke from the bakery reached the upper atmosphere. Down in the narrow alleyways, the scent of burnt sugar and scorched flour lingered like a ghost, but Park Joon-hwa was already miles away. He didn't head for a hospital and he didn't head for a bunker. He headed for the one place his enemies thought he would never dare to tread, the heart of the Kim Syndicate's private estate. He arrived not with a subtle strike team, but with the roar of an armored motorcade that tore through the estate's wrought iron gates like they were made of parchment. Joon-hwa stepped out of the lead vehicle before it had even come to a full stop. His navy suit was torn, his knuckles were bared to the bone, and his face was smeared with the ash of the sanctuary his enemies had dared to burn. The Ice King was gone. In his place was something far more ancient and far more terrifying. Chairman Kim. Joon-hwa's voice wasn't a shout. It was a thunderclap that echoed off the white marble pillars of the mansion. He didn't wait for an answer. He moved through the lobby like a force of nature, his suppressed weapon barking a rhythmic, lethal cadence. Every guard who stepped into his path was met with the cold, surgical precision of a man who had nothing left to fear, because he had finally found something worth losing. Joon-hwa wasn't fighting for territory tonight. He wasn't fighting for profit. He was fighting for the 7-year-old boy who had taught him how to play cards, and for the woman who had kept the light on in a bakery for a decade while he sat in the dark. He reached the upper study, kicking the double doors open. Chairman Kim sat behind a desk of carved obsidian, his face pale, a glass of amber liquid trembling in his hand. He looked at Joon-hwa and saw a man he didn't recognize. "You were supposed to be dead 10 years ago," Kim stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "The poison, the doctors. You were a man with no tomorrow. You were supposed to fade away." Joon-hwa walked toward him, the heavy thud of his boots the only sound in the room. He didn't stop until he was leaning over the desk, his shadow swallowing the older man whole. "The doctors told you I was sterile, Kim. They told you I couldn't father a child. They told you I was a king with no heir." Joon-hwa reached out, his hand closing around Kim's throat with a slow, agonizing pressure. "You believed the science. You believed the logic. But you forgot that some fires don't go out just because you starve them of oxygen. Please." Kim wheezed, his eyes bulging. "It was just business. A strategic strike." "Business is what I did for 30 years, Joon-hwa whispered, his eyes flashing with a dark, incandescent heat. "What you did today was personal. You sent poison to my son's home. You turned his mother's dreams into ash." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a chilling final register. "For 10 years I was called the Ice King because I had nothing to warm my heart. I was cold because I was empty. But today you gave me a reason to burn. And I promise you by the time the sun rises, there won't be enough left of your empire to fill a matchbox." With a final decisive movement, Joon-hwa silenced the man who had tried to steal his future. He didn't feel the rush of victory or the satisfaction of revenge. He only felt the heavy, solid weight of responsibility. He walked out of the mansion as his men began the systematic dismantling of the Kim Syndicate. He didn't look back at the flames beginning to lick at the curtains. He climbed into his car and gave a single command: the extraction point. Now. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the Han River when Joon-hwa arrived at the secure safehouse on the outskirts of the city. He walked through the reinforced doors, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that no battle had ever caused. Naomi was standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the first light of dawn. She looked exhausted, her apron gone, her chef's coat replaced by one of his own oversized sweaters. When she saw him, the terror in her eyes dissolved into a raw, staggering relief. She didn't say a word. She simply crossed the room and threw her arms around him, her warmth a jarring beautiful contrast to the cold metal and blood that clung to his clothes. "Is it over?" she whispered into his chest. "The threat is gone," Joon-hwa replied, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the faint, lingering scent of vanilla that even the smoke couldn't fully erase. "They will never touch you again. They will never touch him." Lucas appeared from the hallway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He looked at his father, bloodied, bruised, and standing in the ruins of his former life, and he didn't see a monster. He saw the man who had stood between him and the dark. Joon-hwa knelt down, opening his arms. Lucas ran to him, and for the first time, the Ice King let the tears fall, unhidden and unashamed. "I lost the bakery, Joon-hwa," Naomi said softly, looking at the three of them, the impossible family gathered in the dawn light. "I lost everything I built." Joon-hwa stood up, holding Lucas in one arm and drawing Naomi close with the other. He looked out at the city he had ruled with fear for so long, and then he looked at the two people who had given him a reason to live. "You didn't lose everything," Joon-hwa said, his voice a vow that would never be broken. "You gained a kingdom. I may be the Ice King, Naomi, but for you and for our son, I will burn the world down every single day if that's what it takes to keep you warm." The transformation was complete. The king who couldn't father a child was standing at the beginning of a dynasty, and as the sun finally broke over the horizon, the ice had finally, beautifully melted away.